Okay.
All right. Welcome to another edition of Unlock Astrology with the one and only Samuel Reynolds. Let me thank you for being here. Hey,
Thank you for having me.
listen, and for people who are go down the rabbit hole. Go back to the first episode that we did, give it a thumbs up, like it, share it, because this is a journey that we're going to go on. This we're going to take you on a journey, but it requires that you have all the information. I think a lot of people start, Sam, in the middle of a story. People jump in,
That's
they go
true.
into the comments watching the first 5 minutes or the first couple of minutes because they know what this is. Go back, find out the origin story, how we got here. And I think that's super important that that you like you went on a journey. You didn't just come into astrology, like I got this. You were a skeptic, you were a Baptist minister, you were an atheist, you're now a practicing Muslim,
Muslim.
and it was through the exploration that you arrived and landed at this space. So before we get into the individual signs, just give people, and I'm still a skeptic, so let me just be clear, even though I do think that there's something to when you're born. So let's start there. Like, I won't go to my horoscopes to see what's going to happen, because I think we talked about this last time. I'm not doing that. But what is it about the signs and when you were born, when you meet somebody, you're like, oh, I know that person is a Sagittarius. I know that person is definitely a Gemini because I have, oh yeah, you act like Kanye and Donald Trump. Like, what is it about the signs and the personality types or traits that come with these signs?
People like some elements of control. It's part of our evolutionary impulse to find ways in order to keep ourselves safe, to be able to group people or have some way of knowing them. There's a good and bad element to that, especially as it relates to astrology. The good element of it is that I think more on a personal level, that if you kind of come to understand the general rubric of a sign, you have some way by which to understand a little more about yourself. I think that becomes the most useful aspect of it, especially if your starting point is the idea of a sun sign. So, for instance, for me, I got a Scorpio on my arm, tattooed on my arm, and a phoenix. And you might remember when we last talked about it, I was on this journey. Part of my journey was like, am I a Scorpio or I'm a Sag? Which is it? And part of embracing the Scorpion was embracing the pathway to transformation, acknowledging what might be base within myself toward going what's elevated, which is the idea of the phoenix. And I loved that imagery, and I felt that that was something to attach to in the terms of ego development as an aspiration, as some way not just about who I am, but who I could be, who I wanted to be. And I think,
Let's pause there because I think so many of us, and for me, the reason why I'm doing this, you know, is because we're not just unlocking astrology, we're not just jailbreaking the university within class with Carr on a Saturday, but this is really about people being free. For me, because the freer people are, I think the better society is. The
sure.
more we're
Hmm.
not locked into these constraints of what, society says we should be, or our parents, or what we think, and we start to explore who are we? Because until individuals can be their full selves, we can't have a full, complete society. And this is that journey. Like, what makes me tick? What are the best elements that will bring out the best in me? What kind of people do I need around me to be better, to be a better
Yeah.
person?
I mean, it's Gnothi Seotan, which means know thyself, right? So I think the best of learning astrology on the lobby level, which is what I'm talking about. When you start talking about signs, you're talking about the lobby level of a very huge skyscraper, literally astrology. And so, I think the best aspect of learning like your sign is through learning more about yourself as an entryway. The worst of it is when you start typing and doing the typology of other people. And where that often goes wrong, from memes to people saying, like you just said, oh, you're a Gemini, you two-faced it. You like, yeah, I had to go there because that's always what comes up. And Geminis are usually gracious enough not to say like well, you're grammar challenged. Um, but you're like, oh yeah, you're like Kanye, or you're like Donald Trump, or you're like Newt Gingrich, or Rudy Giuliani. All of them are Geminis. And so is Prince, right? So there is a thread between those. I can get to that when we talk about Gemini, but there is a thread in terms of how those men and even some women kind of aggregate a certain way. But people start focusing on more what they know about the sign rather than having contemplated the fuller dimensions of the sign. Now, how do you get to more of the fuller dimensions of the sign? Because we haven't even talked about, I think everyone should have a fuller dimension of their chart. When people call into the show, I start talking to them about their charts. They might think like, oh, then this is true about Aries. I'm not talking about, Aries or Taurus. I'm talking about them as what happens to their particular chart. So um, that's what becomes essential, in terms of unpacking that. So when people really get into like, oh, he's an Aries, I'm a Gemini, or I'm a Pisces, they start thinking about all their stereotypes. The other thing they start thinking about in terms of compatibility, because people come up to me all the time like, listen, I'm a Scorpio and she's a Gemini. Are we compatible? Now, how I hear that is, I'm from Brooklyn, she's from Queens. Are we compatible? Right? Which is like, you just gave me a bit of useless information. Like, I don't have enough from this to be able to give you much of anything. So it's like I said, the lobby level, it's the superficial level, it's the entry point. And I think it's best as a starting point for understanding oneself. But when you start getting into other people, I will just say you generally may not know enough.
Okay. All right. So let's start there. What is it about when you were born, the time you were born? Because you always ask, when were you born?